The thing about being in and around security cover like that is deer are a hell of a lot easier to call. I mean,
Yeah.
I killed one. I snort wheezed in a buck in Wisconsin, I think 2016, and I was in a clear cut, and they selectively logged this property, and so it's pretty thick and gnarly, but they left some good seed trees in there, and there's a creek bottom in there, and I snuck in there in the morning and got a stand up, and it was windy, and I was over this creek, so I couldn't hear a whole lot. And I didn't realize it, but this buck had made it past me to go up to bed. I just saw his rack come up feeding. And so I actually snort wheezed at him. I think I snort wheezed 5 times before he turned around. But I was just in a place where he felt comfortable, and it was thick enough where he didn't know, he can look, but he can't see a whole lot. And so it's
Yeah.
just a good calling scenario. And I think people, especially this time of year, you look at social media, everybody's got their decoy out in their food plot, or everybody's banging their antlers together over a cut cornfield. And man, that stuff can work on private places and in a lot of places. But if you're a public land hunter and you want to call in a buck, you probably want to get into the thick stuff. If you get into those easy places lots of people can get to, everybody's called to them already.
Yeah, they just give you a look and that's it.
Yeah, if they're even around. And so
Right.
I want to back up a second because I know you sent me a photo from that pack you had laying on your ground that had the tag on it, and uh, don't feel bad about it, man. Everybody loses bucks over dumb stuff, and
Yeah.
that was like and your pack was a frame pack, and
Yeah.
you're carrying in enough stuff it looks like to carry out a deer essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's so my hunting partner and I, that's kind of how we like to do it because it's just as far as terrain go, it's so rocky in parts of these hills that we're hunting, and you know, as far as meat care goes, it tends to be a lot better as far as your venison goes when you're packing it out. You get it out of the skin quicker. You're not dragging it 4 miles. We've had a lot of good luck with that. So
Yeah. Well, that's I do the same thing. I use a frame pack, I guess I should say. I use my elk pack most of these days, just partially because you got to carry a lot of crap in anyway, and because if I kill one, I could leave my stand on the ground with my sticks and whatever and pack out or however I need to, but I can get an entire deer in there if I bone it out and
yeah,
carry it out, and that does something for you, I think. And I know how far in you were hunting. And what I think it does is you go, okay, well, now I'm not concerned with where I shoot a buck. I'm just going to hunt wherever they're going to be. And if I kill them, I just work them on out. It's the same thing. It's the attitude you have to have elk hunting if you want to be successful. If you're like,
yeah,
I don't want to kill one here, then you shouldn't be, you shouldn't be hunting there. And you see that with whitetail hunters a lot where they're like, oh man, I don't want to drag one out of that hole. And
yeah,
over and over and over again, I talk to whitetail hunters who are kind of like me, where they don't really, that doesn't factor into it. It's like, let's just go hunt where we can. If we kill one, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But you were prepared for that. And that's just something worth thinking about.
yeah. And it's a learning curve because last year we packed my buck out, and I thought, oh, I'm just gonna go to Cabela's, and they have like those vests, that you can pack meat out with. And I thought it's a great idea. They say, it's all the weights on your shoulders, nothing's redistributed. So we actually had to leave the deer out in the field, bring our gear back. And fortunately, there was a game commission officer that was like, oh, you guys, he checked us out and he was like, oh, you know what? You guys are doing everything by the book. Let me drive you out there. So
That's
I ended up
awesome.
getting lucky with that one. And, I have actually gotten to stay in touch with him, and he's a cool dude.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that was a good buck you killed. There are a lot of solutions to getting game out. Game carts are awesome if you can use them.
Yeah.
I don't. There are a lot of places I hunt you can't use. If you're on walk-in land in most places, you can't use them because they have wheels on them. It just depends. And so that can be a good option. Most places you're not driving a four-wheeler in there if you have one. So it's like, you're going to drag it, and dragging a deer out sucks out of a lot of places. And so that option of going Western for the game, the meat retrieval is awesome if you have the right gear and you know how to use it. Those vests you're talking about, those are no bueno, man.
No, not at all. No.
They don't work. You got to get something, I look at a lot of my whitetail gear now, and I suspect you're the same way, where a lot of it, I look to the Western guys, like what's popular out there that they're using. Because when you're doing what you're doing and what I'm doing and hiking in there and carrying all your stuff in, you really do want lightweight stuff. Like you really want lightweight, quiet stuff. You want your clothes with real good warmth to weight ratios. And because it's not, I just had a conversation with an editor of mine about, the stereotypes that Western hunters have for whitetail hunting and how whitetail hunters have these stereotypes for Western hunters. I think we're going to do a whole podcast on it. But the reality is, if you're working hard at public land whitetails, you're working hard. Like it's not an easy thing, and you need the best gear possible. And one of those things is just a good pack that you can throw a bunch of protein in.
Yep. And, the frame is great for carrying your tree stand too. The, straps that tree stands come with are just terrible. And you don't want to leave them under your stand when you're hanging there, have those things blowing in the wind. So it is a lot easier to carry things in that way.
Yeah. What are you using for a stand for your hang and hunt?
I have a Hawk Helium XL, and I like this. I'm a little bit nervous with heights. And actually, like this year's, I think I've climbed a tree so many times this year that it's not bothered. I'm going up about 20, 25 feet. But usually I like that bigger stand. It just makes me feel a little bit better.
Yeah. They make good stuff. I like their stuff a lot.
And it's really comparable as far as that goes.
Do you want some deer hunting advice?
Yeah.
There isn't a deer out there that you need to go 25 feet up to kill. Just so you know.
And normally I don't. The only time I ever do is if I don't have a lot of overhead cover or something like that. Normally I'm right around like probably about 18 feet is my average, I would say.
Yeah. I run into that a lot. If I'm hunting in Wisconsin over there on those clear cuts, because the trees that are left usually don't have a lot of cover. And so you might have those telephone pole trees left where you're like, well, I can get a stand up in them really easily, but I stick out like a sore thumb. I mean, I get picked off over there all the time. And, I carry four sets of lone wolf sticks now and try to get up. I'm real comfortable in the 18, 20 foot range. I don't like going much higher than that. And even then, facing away from where I think the deer are going to come from and trying to hug that tree, you still get picked off sometimes. But it's just a function of, even though you might get busted, you're still, if you want to hunt a spot that bad, you just hunt it and roll the dice.
Yeah. I normally really like a really giant tree too, because that's, I find that's the best thing to not get picked off. That was my scenario last year. I could barely touch my fingers together around that tree last year, and it was a great, ended up being a great spot. And I think in that scenario, I think I was probably only up 12 feet because of how many branches were after that. It was just too hard to get a shot below the branches if I went above them. So
yeah. Well, that's a function of climbing lots of trees and get used to it. I mean, you can make a lot of trees work. We run into that, the big tree scenario quite a bit when we head out west. If I hunt western North Dakota or something, and you're dealing with a limited amount of cottonwoods along the river. And a lot of them are 3 times the size of the strap for your tree stand. So you're just looking for that one tree that you can get around. But, getting into a tree that is, at least as wide as your shoulders is awesome. It just gives you a lot more confidence than when you're in. I've been hunting into some small trees in Wisconsin this year, and it's a little rough, especially in the wind.
Yeah, when the wind blows.
Yep. So let's talk about, so that buck. Oh, I was going to ask you this. How big was that buck that they had blow up in Pennsylvania?
So he was an 8 pointer. He was a little bit bigger than the buck that I shot last year, and that buck was almost it was 123 in an 8. So he was bigger than that.
Yeah.
So I probably I'm thinking 125, 130 somewhere around there.
So a Pope and Young buck on public land.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is a good deer.
Yeah.
Which is, I've ranted about this 100 million times, but 125-inch deer, 99.6% of the hunters that see 125-inch deer are grabbing their weapons so fast it's not even there's no question in their mind. And yet
Right.
you go out and you talk to people at a pro shop, or you look at these idiots on social media, and it's like, oh, that's a 2-year-old that needs a bunch more years. And it's like, man, you're so you're so disconnected from reality if you could look at a buck like that on public land in a state like Pennsylvania and not think that that's a freaking trophy. That's a great deer.
Absolutely. And it's just like he was just gnarly. Like the spots were all tore up on his back from going under fences or fighting or whatever, and his back just looked hard and rounded. You know what I mean? He was all fat already, and he was a good looking deer.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I've never seen a 125-inch buck where I was like, oh, that deer sucks.
Yeah.
I'm always like, hey, that thing's awesome. And the reality on that buck, people, I think, and I've talked about this a lot, but I think the biggest, one of the worst things that the outdoor industry did to us as hunters was convince us of the lie that we can age bucks on the hoof. And people, I still read this all the time from people who should know way better, but will talk all the time about, if you live in Iowa, your 2.5-year-olds make Pope and Young. No, they don't. Go down there. If that were the case, their 6.5-year-olds would be 300 inches. Like when I couldn't believe it. I've hunted Iowa a couple times, and yeah, they have great bucks. Yeah. But you see 1.5-year-olds that are Forkies. You see 2.5-year-olds that are 83-inch 8-point. I mean, and I was like, these bucks look exactly like all the bucks I see in all the other places I hunt. There's just more bucks getting mature, and some of those mature bucks top out really high. The 150s, 160s, 170s. But 125-inch buck, if you start sending in the teeth on those deer, an awful lot of those deer are 5.5 years old, 6.5 years old. And people don't believe me because we've been told, it's like, oh, they're, 80 inches the first year and they're 125 inches the second year. And, I see people talk all the time. We're like, oh, we've got this deer on our farm that's a 3-year-old that's 170 inches. And I'm like, on what planet? Like where? Okay, well, we know you're saving that deer. We know nobody else is going to get to hunt it. And yet you never kill 400-inch bucks. What happened? He topped out at 3 years old. Like he topped out. And so anyway, that's a rant on my part. It drives me nuts because I see it all the time and it's just pure silliness.
Yeah. I mean, I do hunt a farm here pretty regularly too. And mostly I just do that for my doe hunting. And I know that when we were kids, my buddy shot a giant, they had opened, a propagation, like the state game lands had opened a propagation close to here. And he shot a giant deer when we were like 14 years old. And I think it ended up, I think it was like 195 and ended up netting 160 or something like that for all the deductions it had. But they said the deer, the taxidermist said the deer was like 7.5. And you would think like a deer 7.5. The thing was, it was like 275 pounds. It was a giant Pennsylvania deer. But, you're right. You just can't imagine a 3-year-old being 170 inches like that.
Well, it's just not, nature isn't working that way. And if people would start sending in their teeth, it's like $20. That's the only way to like really know. And and it's not 100% accurate, but it's a hell of a lot closer than, looking at them on the hoof or looking at the teeth wear or anything. And it's a real eye opener. Because a lot of the deer we underage. My opinion is we underage a lot of deer, and so I don't know. Anyway, so all right, let's move on. I'll get enough hate mail over that, because I always do every time I bring it up. But somehow it doesn't stop me. Let's talk. Before we move on to your Ohio trip, because I want to get into your planning a little bit, because you were kind of keeping me informed on that. I want to talk a little bit about. I want to keep going down this big woods, hunting, scouting, trying to figure out deer where there are no easy destination food sources. So before this hunt transpired, where you had this big Pennsylvania buck come in that they snort wheezed in. You had been doing a lot of scouting and a lot of map work on X, and what, kind of lead us up to that. Like what were you doing this summer to get yourself into a position to have that deer that close this time of year?
Sure. Like, so most of mine starts with shed hunting, and it's just really, I find, and I find that my fitness ends up being better if I'm doing something outside. And I'm not ever getting enough if I'm not if I'm just walking down the street outside, it's not enough. Like I need, some muscle work in it. So climbing the mountains and that kind of thing is what I really like to do. So, I afford a couple hours every, couple days a week to get out and go shed hunting and find those bedding. It's really easy in the snow to find beds and where they're bedding. And then, even in the snow where they might be feeding at that time, but you can kind of pick out your different times of year food sources, like where your white oaks are. And, here in the area of Pennsylvania that I live and that I hunt, white oaks are everywhere. So they don't really key in on any specific ones. So you kind of have to figure out which ones are dropping first when the fall gets in. But, I usually end up finding, the travel routes between bedding areas, points on ridges. That's, the typical stuff as far as mountain hunting goes.
Yeah. That whole thing with, it's one of the things that, people will ask for hunting advice, or they'll seek out like, oh, what are the deer eating right now? And, if they were in your neck of the woods and somebody said white oaks, like it's the right answer, but it doesn't do them any good. It's like southern Minnesota where I grew up. If somebody was like, "Oh man, what's the thing to hunt over in, on the September opener?" I'd be like, "Well, soybeans." But like, what if your farm has 400 acres of soybeans, or what if you're on public land and there are no it's just there's a lot going on. But those winter walks, that winter scouting, the shed hunting, I'm the same way when it comes to big wood stuff. I really think burning some boot leather out there in the winter is a big deal if you're going to be successful in the fall.